housekeeping items. Exhibits are officially closed for the winter. We hope to reopen again in the beginning of May. So please join us there and check out our website for more details. If you are interested in doing research through the museum, you can also go to our website and check on the research tab right at the top there. Or you can email our archivists at archives.atwood@gmail.com. They will be happy to assist you. We are still firming up dates, but you can mark your calendar for Tuesday, February 16th at 5 o'clock, as our next talk will be about John and Abigail Adams with guest speaker Hannah Carlson. So we look forward to having that. So when we get into our program today, please use the question and answer feature in Zoom, and all the questions by tonight's speaker will be answered after the lecture. So now for this evening's program. Tonight's speaker is a retired attorney and retired colonel in the United States Army. He spends his leisure time as a docent here at the Atwood, which makes me very happy. And he's also a member of the Marine Mammal Rescue Team for IFAW, a member of the Coast Guard Auxiliary, and the master of the Pilgrim Masonic Lodge. He also works as a mate on the Harwich Port to Nantucket Freedom ferry. He resides in Harwich Port with his wife Gaylene, who's a docent and volunteer manager of the Atwood Gift Shop. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Bob Heppe.
Thank you, Kevin. Good evening, everyone. I'm Bob Heppe, and I'm here tonight on behalf of Dr. Joseph Lincoln. As a docent at the Atwood for the past 3 years, I have responsibility for 9 galleries. To me, the most interesting of those 9 is the Joseph C. Lincoln Room. Several years ago, I had seen the 2008 movie, The Golden Boys. I knew it was partially filmed in Chatham, but I had no idea that the screenplay was based on Dr. Lincoln's first novel, Captain Eri, published in 1904. Unfamiliar with The Golden Boys, it's a comedy starring Bruce Dern, Muriel Hemingway, David Carradine, Charles Durning, and Julie Harris. Some of you may have seen the 2009 movie, The Lightkeepers. The Lightkeepers was based on Dr. Lincoln's 1911 book, The Women Haters. It starred Richard Dreyfuss, Bruce Dern, Blythe Danner, and the late Julie Harris in her last film role. I had no idea that 7 of Dr. Lincoln's books were made into movies and 1 into a Broadway play, or that most of his 42 books had appeared on bestseller lists. I also had no idea that he had written hundreds of short stories and poems that were published in national magazines before he ever wrote a book. Most surprising of all was that most of my visitors had never heard of him. Being a dutiful docent, I bought my first Lincoln novel, Captain Eri, in 2017 to study and learn about my subject. And then I bought a couple of more, and then a couple of more. Eventually, I bought and read all 38 novels, 2 books of short stories, and a book of poetry. To prepare for this talk, which I've had a lot since we had the break with COVID, I reread several books and a biography. How many out there have read Joe Lincoln? Hands up. I sell used copies of most of his books right here at the Atwood. $10. When cutters die, they give their beach houses and their Cadillacs to their families. The Atwood gets their Lincoln. This evening, I will try to give you a brief, and I mean brief. The first rendition of this talk was an hour and a half. A portrait of Dr. Lincoln the boy, Dr. Lincoln the man, some of his writing, and some other of the things that have made him nationally known and admired here locally. I will often refer to Dr. Lincoln as just plain Joe. After reading all of his novels and learning about his life, calling this native Cape Codder anything more pretentious just seems wrong. After becoming a Joe Lincoln fan, I soon became friends with Katherine Manson, Atwood archivist and a genuine Lincoln expert. I imposed on Katherine to find some hard-to-get editions, and she was immensely helpful in doing that. More importantly, she gave me great insight into the real Joe Lincoln. Last summer, Katherine surprised me with a gift copy of Cape Cod Stories. This is a rare copy of a 1912 book of 11 previously published short stories. September a year ago, Commander retired Don Broderick, famous Navy helicopter pilot, maestro pianist, Atwood archivist, and most recently chair of the Atwood House Speakers Bureau, heard me extolling on Joe Lincoln to a cornered Atwood visitor. Always looking to fill his speaker's dance card, I was recruited on the spot. Please note, I am a Joe Lincoln enthusiast and student. I am not an expert. The rest of you may be Joe Lincoln experts. So if you are, and if I get something wrong about Dr. Lincoln or his books or his short stories or his plays or his poetry, as I'm sure I will, I would like you to make your comments in writing and send them to me at Post Office Box 78 in Harwich Port. As our former museum director, Danielle, once declared in the book section of the Atwood House Gift Shop, all literature is personal. So it is with Dr. Lincoln. If you read his books, you will not love every single one. Some who have read only one are quick to give an opinion on all. They sometimes say he is corny, too optimistic, too sentimental, too predictable. Some of his strongest critics, when queried closely, have actually never read him at all. Some of those critics sometimes say Joe was a writer of his own time and place. Of course, they don't say that about Henry David Thoreau, who limited his worldview to a small part of the town of Concord and one walk along the Cape Cod seashore. Joe Lincoln was an unabashed optimist and romantic. His stories twist and turn, but eventually turn out the way you want them to. Although critics often look down on this optimism as being unrealistic, Joe thought his so-called optimism was true realism. Remember, he wrote during 2 world wars and the Great Depression. He did not have to invent hard times and challenges. As he wrote in an article in 1926, an author does not have to work harder or do better, truer work to make his hero and heroine end up in a garbage heap rather than in a flower garden. I insist a reasonable, cheerful attitude toward Hi, folks. We're back again. Like I was saying, it was said that not every Cape Codder loved Joe's books when they came out because they thought they saw themselves in those books. Joe said he made up his characters from composites of people he knew and people he knew about, but he never actually wrote about an actual person. However, some of those folks, some of those depictions might have been a little too close to home. A typical Lincoln book is usually rooted in a small Cape Cod town. To protect the guilty, Joe never clearly identifies the town. Instead, he takes 2 actual towns and makes up his own. Some of them are Harness from Harwich and Dennis, Orleans from Orpham from Orleans and Eastham, and Trumet from Truro and Pamet. Ostable County is created by combining Osterville and Barnstable. If you were driving down Belmont Street in West Harwich, you'll come upon Joe Lincoln Road. Joe Lincoln Road leads to smaller streets named after his towns. You'll find Osterville Road, Harness Road, and Trumet Road. Most developers, when they're doing a development, will name their streets after family members. Not this developer. He or she was a Joe Lincoln fan. If you drive through downtown Harwich Port, past Post Office Square, you'll come to Lincoln Village Road. The homes on Lincoln Village Road are named after the titles of Joe's books, another developer who was a Joe Lincoln fan. Joe also takes real Cape Cod landmarks and physical features, which we Cape Codders will immediately recognize. But then he mixes them up so you think you know where you are, but you're never quite sure. Joe's characters use real old Cape Cod dialect and nautical terms, but he never makes it up. Every expression or idiom he uses, he had actually heard spoken by a Cape Codder. For instance, Ned Winslow, in Joe's novel Shavings, is depicted realistically as a carver of souvenir windmills. Ned's character is a result of Joe spending a lot of time in the carving shop of his great friend and world-class bird carver, Elmer Kroll. Ned's character is not based on Elmer's character, but the depiction of a carver in his shop is based on Joe's real-life experience in Elmer's shop. And we actually have a picture of Elmer's shop, but I don't think we're going to put that up tonight. In the novel Queer Judson, James Carey Judson Jr. comes home to the Cape a financial failure and creates a new life carving shorebirds. Joe's depiction of Judson painting the wings of the birds ever so fine is pure Kroll. Joe's recounting that Judson paid back his debts, carving those birds, is pure Lincoln. A note on Elmer Kroll. We all know that Mr. Kroll, a local boy from East Harwich, had started carving out duck decoys. But when that business went away, he started carving shorebirds. He eventually became known as the greatest bird carver in America. Many of you have noticed the beautiful carving of a kingfisher in the bookcase in the Joseph C. Lincoln room. Mr. Kroll carved this bird for his friend Joe Lincoln. Kevin and I broke into the bookcase and took this picture, which you can't see now, so you have to remember if you saw the bird. Krolls are worth tens of thousands, so of course it was locked up and we had to get it out. On Joe's death, the kingfisher went to his son Freeman, and from Freeman to his wife, Virginia. Virginia gave the bird to a Mrs. Virginia Duran. Not any Virginia Duran, our Virginia Duran, who built our Duran Gallery and filled it with her world-class collections. Mrs. Duran liked that bird so much that she collected 32 more, had them restored, and gave them to the Atwood. And that's where the collection comes from in the Duran Gallery. I get a great kick out of tying the two galleries together through the friendship of Elmer Kroll and Joe Lincoln. A typical Joe Lincoln novel will have as one of its main characters a retired sailing ship captain, or two or three. His first novel, Captain Erie, had three captains. These are plain-spoken sailors who usually turn out to be the smartest and most worldly characters in the story. There's usually a young man, often conflicted by love or circumstance, a beautiful and strong young woman, also conflicted. There's always a dilemma to be solved, a mystery to be solved, or romance, or typically all three. The foil is without fail a pompous New Yorker or Bostonian who thinks the captain a country fool until he or she slowly realizes that they are the fool. Several of Joe's characters are drawn from interactions with local antique dealers. Joe himself was quite a collector of antique furniture and sandwich glass. He knows the professional dealers and their ways intimately. Antique dealers appear routinely in his books. In the 1928 novel, Silas Bradford's Boy, we are introduced to Ebenezer Tadgett, a savvy but very scrupulous and extraordinarily kind antique dealer. Tadgett is considered one of Joe's best characters. Tadgett takes great care of his disabled wife, explaining, "I married her for better or worse. I'm not cutting out because she got worse." Joe does not write about religion directly. He does, however, have great fun depicting the social hierarchy of the various Protestant churches, their congregations, their ministers, and their ministers' wives. In Tiny Brewster, where Joe grew up, there were several Protestant churches competing for members. He does not write about other religions because in the Cape Cod he grew up in, there were few Catholics and no Catholic churches. There were few Jews and no synagogues. As a result, the Protestants get all the attention and sometimes all the abuse. Joe's novel, Keziah Coffin, depicts a war between Protestant churches. In that novel, the new young minister of the regular church falls in love with the adopted daughter of the minister of the competing conservative church. Joe himself was an enthusiastic Unitarian Congregationalist and sat on the board of his church in Hackensack, New Jersey. Joe must have studied his Bible carefully because at least 15 of his fictional captains have biblical first names. Joe enjoyed making fun of fads. In an early novel, Mr. Pratt, Joe writes about two wealthy New Yorkers who come to the Cape in search of the natural life. This is a spoof of a fad running through the cities at that time. Joe was born and raised on Cape Cod, but he spent much of his adult life in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. He knew all about the latest fads, and of course, they appear in his stories. In another early novel, Captain Warren's Wards, retired Captain Elisha Warren of Cape Cod is surprisingly made guardian of his young niece and nephew. They are the children of his deceased and estranged brother. They are two spoiled and self-proclaimed sophisticated New Yorkers. They resent Captain Warren at first, calling him an uncouth countryman. Later they learn he has saved them from financial ruin and disrepute at the hands of the so-called sophisticated friends, New York friends. Also in Captain Warren's Wards, Joe tells the reader what it felt like when he, Joe, published his first novel. In the book, Joe Pearson wrote a seafaring novel with the help of Captain Warren, which was well received. As a result, Pearson no longer needs to seek publishers, they seek him. Exactly what happened to Joe after he published Captain Eri. Joe's stories often revolve around a post office and a postmaster or postmistress. Post offices in Joe's childhood were the community center of gossip and debate, and the gossipers were usually all men. Hey, now we're back to having pictures. Here's a picture of the gossipers at the post office. Conveniently for research purposes, Joe's aunt, Martha Crosby Huckins, was the postmistress of the Brewster Post Office, which she ran in the millinery shop in the back of Joe's house. As a young boy, Joe spent a lot of time in that post office, so he knew of what he wrote. In the novel The Postmaster, Joe draws upon these boyhood experiences in depicting the post office, the local gossipers, and many of the adventures of its postmaster, Captain Zebulon Snow. Now, this is a picture of Joe's house when he was young. The furthest back L is where Martha had her post office, and the front room is where Joe was born. The railroad depot. Another community center in the late 1800s Cape Towns was the railroad depot. In the novel, The Depot Master, Joe tells the reader of the influence of the depot master, retired Captain Solomon Berry. Joe describes the post office, conveniently located in the hardware store next to the depot, as follows. And I'm going to read this to you. 6:15 p.m. Time to be getting down to the depot and post office. At least a dozen male citizens of East Harness were thinking the very same thing at that very moment. It was a community habit of long standing to see the train come in and go after the mail. The facts that the train bore no passengers in whom you were intimately interested and that you expected no mail made little difference. If you were a man of 30 or older, you went to the depot or the club just as your wife or sister went to the sewing circle for sociability and mild excitement. If you were a single young man, you went to the post office for the same reason that you attended prayer meeting. If you were a single young lady, you went to the post office and prayer meeting to furnish a reason for the young man. So why read Lincoln? One reason, his critics through the years have agreed on one thing. Joe Lincoln, without any formal training, gave the rest of the country a history of Cape Cod and its people that endeared the Cape to the place to people far and wide. Joe is credited with creating Cape Cod tourism. Unlike Patty Page, who sang of old Cape Cod without ever having been here, Joe Lincoln, his parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents were of the Cape. He was celebrated throughout his life as the interpreter of Cape Cod. As he told the poet Joyce Kilmer, just before Kilmer was killed in World War I, I'm a Cape Codder. My people have been Cape Codders for generations. They have lived at the Cape when they were at home, but most of the time, of course, they were at sea. I was born at Cape Cod and spend my summers there. I cannot imagine myself ever tiring of Cape Cod. Hildegard Hawthorne, granddaughter of Nathaniel Hawthorne, wrote of Joe in her pamphlet entitled Joe Lincoln's America. Joe is saving for us a previous part of America, writing down before it is too late a past recent enough but changing fast, a past closely woven into the very fiber of our character and meaning as a nation. Chester Crocker, Toastmaster of the 300th anniversary banquet in Barnstable in 1939, an event in which Joe was both an honored guest and the featured speaker, introduced him as follows. Joe has written more novels about Cape Cod, and his novels have won greater popular acclaim than any other author the Old Peninsula has ever produced. Why, we Cape Codders have to read Joe Lincoln so that we'll know how to act so we don't disappoint the summer folks. So who was Joe Lincoln, and where did he come from? Well, he was born in Brewster in 1870. And Queen Victoria was on the British throne, and General Ulysses S. Grant was president. Joe's father, both grandfathers and great-grandfather were all sailing ship captains. His father went to sea at 15, and by 28 was the captain of the Maria. Remember, from the 1700s until the mid-19th century, many of Americans' sailing ship captains were born and raised on Cape Cod, where they learned to sail on some of the world's trickiest waters. Many of these retired captains came home wealthy and worldly and built mansions throughout the Cape. They were the selectmen, bank presidents, church leaders, and entrepreneurs. They were the men Joe knew about and heard about as a young man. They were the men he later brought to life in his stories. Because his father, Captain Joe Lincoln, died when Joe was only 10 months old, he never knew his father. His father was known to him only through the stories of his mother, other family members, and other retired sailors. In Joe's second novel, Partners of the Tide, the personal qualities of retired skipper Captain Ezra Titcomb, and there he is right there, bear a strong resemblance to those reportedly of Joe's father, Captain Joseph Lincoln. Captain Titcomb is aggressive, determined, and wanted his own way, but is at the same time altruistic and open-minded with a strong love for others, exactly what other people said about Captain Joe. It seems probable that Joe was either consciously or unconsciously describing his father. In the novel Silas Bradford's Boy, Silas Bradford Sr. goes to sea at 14, makes captain at 22, and dies away from home at 35 when Silas Jr. was 5. He is described by Joe on page 326 of that book as follows, quote, "Yet that father was not as he was to others, the hollowed memory of flesh and blood personality. He was, to his son, but a shadow, although, of course, a very wonderful shadow." Again, Joe describes his own feeling about his father. Joe's mother, Emily, was a Cape Cod Crosby, and Joe's full name is Joseph Crosby Lincoln. Joe's mom and dad, Captain Joe and Emily Lincoln, sailed together many times to far-off corners of the world. They came to know foreign harbors as well as they knew their own home ports. They were truly citizens of the greater world. On these voyages, Emily was a correspondent and wrote often to her family in Brewster. Her letters reveal that she and Captain Joe were on the bark Wyman in South America in 1861, on the bark Kleber in New Orleans in July 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War and just 6 days after the fall of Vicksburg, and the Mist in Glasgow in 1867, bound for India in 68, and back to London in 69. In the last 2 pages of the novel Keziah Coffin, Captain Nathaniel Hammond takes his bride Keziah on a wedding voyage from England to Calcutta, just like Joe's parents. As I said earlier, Joe never knew his father. Captain Joe died at 43 on his last ship, the Aurelia, while anchored in Charleston, South Carolina. This is a picture of the Mist. This is a model that Joe made of Captain Joe's favorite ship, the Mist, which he skippered to India from 1867 to 69. Joe had the model made in middle age, again, clearly to honor Captain Joe, the father he never knew. Joe was raised until he was 13 by his mother, Emily Crosby Lincoln, his aunt, Martha Crosby Huckins, and his step-grandmother, Phoebe Crosby Crosby, in the home in Brewster built by Captain Joe. As a result of being raised in a home filled with strong Crosby women, Joe's books evidence a great deal of feeling and respect for the strength, intelligence, and fortitude of the so-called weaker sex. For instance, in the novel The Aristocratic Miss Brewster, Joe writes of Mary Brewster of Wappamatic, a sophisticated and former wealthy young woman who, needing funds to keep her home, takes a job in the National Bank. This is much to the chagrin of her old-fashioned maid. In the novel Great Aunt Lavinia, published during the Great Depression, Joe writes of Lavinia Hall Badger, also of Wappamatic. He shows Lavinia's business sense by having her quietly selling off inherited mining stock, which she deemed questionable, and reinvesting in Class A securities, savings accounts, and government bonds. Meanwhile, her broker had advised her to keep the mining stock and goes bankrupt when he keeps his share. Linnea prevails. Joe's model, of course, was his Aunt Martha. As a boy, Joe lived in Brewster on what was then Route 6, now 6A, just down the road from his school, his church, and the local store, Captain Warren Lincoln's store. As we know, a Captain Warren appears in his early novel, Captain Warren's Wards. Joe had a typical boyhood wandering the beaches of Cape Cod Bay and the forests around his home and fishing in nearby lakes. Joe was reportedly not a great student, but early on developed a love of reading. Conveniently, he lived 300 feet from the Ladies Circulating Library, which still exists today, but is now known as the Brewster's Ladies Library Association. At 13, his grandmother, Phoebe Crosby Crosby, passed away. Up until that time, his mother had worked as a housekeeper to Phoebe and his Aunt Martha. But with his grandmother's passing, Emily had to find other work. She and Joe, to Chelsea, Massachusetts in 1883. But even while living in Chelsea, Joe spent his summers in Brewster and Chatham with his favorite cousin, Susan Huckins Howard. Now, if we were together today, I'd ask if any of the relatives of any of these Crosbys were in our audience. So if you'd raise your hand, we'll know who you are. Joe continued his studies until age 15 when he graduated from Chelsea's Williams Grammar School. The Great Fire of 1908 destroyed Williams Grammar School, so we don't know too much about Joe's school history, but we do know that he was the editor of the school newspaper. Grammar school was the end of Joe's formal education. He never attended high school or college. Nonetheless, in addition to his sterling literary career, he later served on the school board in Hackensack, New Jersey, taught classes at Harvard College when his son Freeman was there, and in 1935 was awarded a doctorate in literature from Rollins College. Today, we would call Joe an overachiever. At the age of 17, Joe became a clerk in a brokerage house in Boston. He was an investment clerk for about 9 years, which is akin to today's junior executive. In 1896, he decided he had no talent for bookkeeping or finance. As he related later in life, I have always felt they were as glad to get rid of me as I was to leave. There's no evidence he did any writing during this time, but his knowledge of investment firms, their partners, their clients, appear in many of his stories later on. After quitting the firm, Joe put out a shingle as a commercial artist. That business didn't go very well. So when the editor and publisher of the Bulletin of the League of American Wheelmen invited him to join as a staff illustrator, Joe accepted. The League of American Wheelmen was the first bicycle club in America, and its home was Boston. In 1896, there are few cars, no buses, and no airplanes. There are horses, carriages, trains, and thousands of bicycles. During the time Joe lived and wrote from 1870 through 1943, he saw the world move from horse carriages, slow trains, fast clipper ships, the first steamships, and bicycles, to cars and trucks, fast trains, the Queen Mary, from the Wright Flyer traveling 852 feet to ocean-going airliners, even the shelling of London by long-range missiles. Joe reflects upon these changes in his novels. In 1905's Partners of the Tide, Bradley Nickerson, an orphan, arrives in his new home by stagecoach. In 1932's Head Tide, Franklin Cobb arrives in Wellmouth from Cleveland by high-speed train. And in 1938, in the novel A. Hall and Company, Estelle Hall arrives home by airplane. The year 1897 was a seminal year in Joe's life and is marked by three major events. First, his mother, Emily, contracted pneumonia and died at age 65. Second, Joe married Florence Flo Sargent. Flo would remain with Joe for the rest of his life. Third, and most interesting to us bibliophiles, on September 17, 1987, Joe Lincoln's name appeared on the masthead of the Wheelman Bulletin as one of three associate editors. Joe's literary career was launched. In an interview in 1925, Joe recalled that everyone on the staff but myself was riding a bicycle in those days. So, knowing nothing of bicycling, I found myself associate editor of the Wheelman Bulletin. In 1896, the Bulletin had a circulation of 59,000. By April 98, circulation had climbed to 114,000. But cars were replacing bicycles, and by December 98, circulation had dropped to 73,000. Joe could see the handwriting on the wall. He quit his job as associate editor in December 98. Flo quit her bookkeeping job. They put their furniture in storage and set out for New York City, the publishing capital of the world. Moving from a comfortable apartment in Boston, they moved to Brooklyn, where they were living on the third floor of a rooming house, cooking over a gas furnace. Joe would later often write of rooming houses and their characters, which he learned from personal experience. Joe found a job at the American Institute of Bankers, where he was the editor of a banking magazine, by day, and at night writing poems and short stories. They would be sent to such magazines as Harper's Bazaar, the Saturday Evening Post, and of course, the Bulletin of the League of American Wheelmen. His first short story to be published was Mrs. Fidget's System, which was published in Harper's Bazaar in 1900. Later that year, the American Press Association published his poem, A Thanksgiving Dream, in their Thanksgiving issue. Also in 1900, three of Joe's short stories were published in the Saturday Evening Post, along with two poems. His poem, The Codfisher, appeared in Harper's later that year. Over the next several years, Joe would write and have published more than 100 short stories and many, many poems. At a time when they could hardly afford it, Joe and Flo moved out of Brooklyn and moved to Hackensack, New Jersey, and rented a home. It was 1900, and Flo was pregnant. For those of you who don't know Jersey, Hackensack is closer to Midtown Manhattan than parts of Yonkers, Queens, or Brooklyn, and it's a lot prettier. Joe and Flo's only child, Joseph Freeman Lincoln, was born in Hackensack in July 1900. Because his father and both of his grandfathers were Josephs, Freeman went by his middle name. Freeman would grow up, attend Harvard, enlist in the Army during World War I, and co-author 3 of Joe's books. In the novel Shavings, the young hero joins the Army during World War I, based on the advice of the old woodcarver Jed Winslow, and against the wishes of his rich pacifist father. A parallel in Joe's own life occurred when Freeman, at age 18, apparently without Joe's advice or consent, enlisted just before the end of World War I. No one is quite sure how Joe felt about his only child enlisting. Also in Shavings, the story of building of an Army air station on the Cape was almost certainly born out of Joe's living in Chatham in 1917, when the Chatham Naval Air Station was built on Nickerson Point and past Eastward Ho, just 2 miles from Joe's new cottage. Like any sane human being, Joe Lincoln hated war, but understood the need for soldiers and admired them greatly. Soldiers were depicted as heroic in 3 of his novels: Shavings, The Portuguese, and The Bradshaws of Harness. Joe himself was a celebrity seller of Liberty War bonds. These celebrity sellers were called 4-minute men by the New York Times. A 4-minute man was a man or woman of some celebrity who gave speeches selling Liberty bonds of no more than 4 minutes wherever they could, their churches, their synagogues, subway stations, wherever. Anxious to serve his country, Joe also wrote and produced a play called Grandpa for the Cape Cod Red Cross in 1918. He acted in the title role. Freeman was also in the play. Over the years, Joe wrote and acted in many plays on Cape Cod and in Hackensack. Let's go back to 1900. During the years 1900 to 1904, while working full-time as an editor at the banking institution, commuting to New York City from Hackensack, serving on the board of trustees of the Unitarian Congregationalist Church, and helping to raise a toddler, Joe kept pumping out and selling short stories and poems, selling them to national magazines, and in 1904, he published his first novel, Captain Eri. Thereafter, Joe wrote and published a novel or book every year for the next 39 years. Some of our more senior Atwood visitors come from Iowa or Indiana or California. They come to the Atwood specifically to visit the Joseph C. Lincoln Room. They tell me of their mom and dad reading Joe Lincoln aloud to their family. Janet Gillespie, author of a biography of her dad, Robert Wicks, Dean of the Princeton University Chapel, wrote in that book as follows. We summered in Westport, Massachusetts, and Mum, who had learned to cook by then, made us little suppers that tasted wonderfully good. And then we'd build up the fire and draw our chairs up close around the kerosene lamp while she read Joseph C. Lincoln aloud. Every night was the same, and eventually we got through the complete works of this New England hero. There would have been 30 of Joe's novels to read in the 1930s when these events occurred. Mrs. Wicks apparently read them all. What about Joe the poet? Before he ever wrote a novel or short story, Joe wrote and published many poems. He modestly referred to his poems as verses, and some were just that. However, when The Codfisher was published in Harper's Bazaar in 1900, the editors of the Boston Journal of Civilization thought otherwise. Recognizing the quality of this poem, these editors proclaimed, "This poem is clear evidence that Joe Lincoln is capable of more than verses. He writes more than the verses he writes for the less critical readers who know him so well." Well, that is fine praise from a rather arrogant corner and rather dismissive criticism of the rest of us who enjoy his other writings. Another poem, The Lifesaver, written in 1898, is also classic poetry. It reveals Joe's admiration for the bravery and dedication of the men who manned the life-saving stations. The Lifesaver appeared in a 1924 anthology entitled Cape Cod Poetry and was quoted by the Reverend Alfred Atwood in its entirety in his 1937 address on Cape Cod and its life-saving service. Joe continued to write verses throughout his life. These verses were either standalone poems, verses repeated or sung as ditties by characters in his stories, written in forewords to other authors' books, or in letters to his 2 grandchildren. His first published poem came out in the Wheelman Bulletin in 1896. Entitled A Query, it was a girl watcher's complaint about the fact that the best-looking women bicyclists always wore ankle-length skirts. Joe would go on to write and publish hundreds of poems over the next 47 years. In 1902, his first book, Cape Cod Ballads and Other Verses, was published. This book was an anthology of 78 poems which had previously appeared in national magazines. Incidentally, Joe was also a published songwriter. In 1903, not much comes out of his sharp pencil because we know he was writing Captain Eri at that time. However, a man named Henry Shepard took one of his jingles from Cape Cod's ballads, set it to music, making Joe a published songwriter. And here's a copy of Susan Van Dusen. In his novels, Joe oftentimes draws on real events. His 1904 novel, Captain Eri, depicts a life-saving rescue in which the victims panic, upset the rescue boat, and all aboard, the rescued and the rescuers drowned, except one. This story parallels the real-life 1902 Wadena disaster in Chatham, where a surfboat rowed by 8 Cape Cod surfmen rowed out in treacherous conditions to rescue 5 crew members stranded on a barge. The victims panic and upset the boat. All 5 victims died, including the owner of the barge. Also dying were 7 of the 8 rescuers. We know what happened from the sole surviving surfman, Seth Ellis of Harwich Port. And there's a picture of the Wadena monument, which is right out near the lighthouse. I'm sure you've driven by it many times, but that's what it signifies. In the novel Rugged Waters, Captain Benori Bartlett, the sole survivor of a disaster similar to Wadena, suffers from anxiety and panic attacks and is haunted by survivor guilt. Today we call that PTSD. In the 1925 movie of the same name, produced by Paramount Pictures, Wallace Beery, and there he is right there in the middle, played Captain Bartlett. Our Atwood Gallery, dedicated to the Coast Guard crew of the motor lifeboat 36500, shows what happens when it all goes right. The Wadena disaster shows how easily it can all go wrong. In order that he could be near his New York publishers, he and Flo lived in Hackensack during the winter from 1900 to 1925. Joe was very active in the Unitarian Congregationalist Church, serving on the Board of Trustees and writing and acting for the Drama Club. In 1912, he was elected to the Board of Education in Hackensack. His poem, The School Committee Man, written sometime before 1901, ends with this verse. We have to listen hard to every word of his and watch him just like kittens do a rat, and laugh at every joke he makes, don't care how old it is, because he can boss the teacher. Think of that. I used to say, when I growed up, I'd be a circus chap and drive 2 lions hitched up like a span. But honest, more I think about it, I believe the best to snap is just to be a school committee man. Joe Lincoln, esteemed grammar school graduate, was now responsible for the college prep education of one of the tonier towns of New Jersey. Joe had become the school committee man, and there's a picture from that poem. When young Freeman and daughter-in-law Virginia moved to Marion, PA in 1925, Joe and Flo followed them and moved into an apartment in the same building. Remember, Joe had lost his father before he ever knew him. He was not going to lose his only child. When Freeman started to build a home in Marion, Joe persuaded him to give up that project, and they built homes next door to each other in Villanova. Joe was the original helicopter parent. There's a picture of Joe, Flo, Freeman, Virginia, and his oldest granddaughter. Joe the playwright. In 1910, Joe ventured into the field of drama. He and his friend Walter Danforth wrote and copyrighted a dramatization of Joe's 1908 novel, Cy Whitaker's Place. The play was copyrighted but never published and exists only in mimeograph form. In 1925, Joe wrote and published a one-act comedy play entitled The Managers. As we know, several of his books were later to be dramatized by other writers, including Shavings, which was made into a Broadway play. From 1902 until 1925, Joe wrote and directed in many plays with the Unitarian Drama Club. We know that he wrote and acted in at least 8 plays. In addition to a novel a year, and his short stories, and his verses, and his plays, and his acting, Joe was in constant demand as a speaker, both in New Jersey and on Cape Cod. Poems, short stories, novels, songwriter, playwright, actor, celebrity speaker. Joe Lincoln was the Rita Moreno of 1930. From 1887 until 1916, Joe spent his summers in Chatham, Brewster, and Harwich Port, either with relatives or as a renter. That all changed in 1916 when he built his summer cottage, the Cross Trees, on Shore Road, just south of Chatham Bar's Inn, where it still stands overlooking the sea. For you non-sailors, a cross tree is a horizontal spreader used to separate the upper shrouds on a mast. Before he built cross trees, Joe had described it in many of his novels. In the novel Thankful's Inheritance, he described Thankful's inherited house as follows: a big, rambling, gray-gabled affair. That novel was published in 1915. And in 1916, Joe built his own big, rambling, gray-gabled affair on Shore Road. Beginning in 1916, Joe would spend up to 6 months a year at Cross Trees. During the year, including those 6 months on the Cape, he typically wrote from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. with a target of 1 chapter a week. He wrote in longhand on long yellow legal paper with a sharp pencil. He never learned to type, so he would send his longhand out to a typist. You can see examples of his writing in our gallery, which were donated by his family. Joe used more than 75 illustrators for his writings, the most famous of which was Harold Bent. Brett. Brett was a lifelong friend and fellow fisherman and golfer on the Cape. He drew the illustrations in the novel Thankful's Inheritance, as well as many of the paintings and line drawings in several of Joe's other works. Mr. Brett painted the 1943 portrait of Joe Lincoln, which hangs in our gallery. Mr. Brett also illustrated Cape Cod Yesterdays, published in 1935. Cape Cod Yesterdays was a series of 16 chapters or remembrances of Joe's early life on the Cape. Each chapter was illustrated by Mr. Brett. There was a Chatham edition of Cape Cod Yesterdays of 1,075 copies, signed by both Joe and Mr. Brett. Joe sent copies of Cape Cod Yesterdays to several friends. A copy was sent to his friend N.C. Wyeth, father of Andrew Wyeth. N.C. illustrated the dust jacket of Joe's 1929 novel, Blair's Attic. N.C. also illustrated for many other authors, including Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. Another copy went to Kenneth Roberts. Joe was friends with and a big fan of Kenneth Roberts of Kennebunkport, Maine. Mr. Roberts is a renowned author of early American historical fiction. Arundel and Northwest Passage are 2 of his most famous novels. When I attended junior high school 60 years ago, my 8th grade teacher, Mr. Hutchinson, was a huge fan of Kenneth Roberts. As a result, I, like Joe, became a huge Kenneth Roberts fan and read most of his novels while still in junior high school. Another signed copy of Cape Cod Yesterdays was sent to Joe's friend, Ms. Elizabeth Reynard. Ms. Reynard was a professor of English at Barnard College and a Chatham summer resident. She wrote the book The Narrow Land, a book of Cape Cod legends. In her will, she left the copyright of The Narrow Land to the Atwood. The proceeds from the copyright helped the Atwood House repair and enlarge the museum, including the gallery of Joseph Lincoln. By the way, Miss Reynard took a leave of absence from Barnard during World War II and helped to establish the Navy Waves. She was the first female lieutenant in naval history. Joe belonged to the Chatham Beach Club and Eastward Ho Country Club. One of his golfing buddies at Eastward Ho was Barton Curry, editor of Ladies' Home Journal. Here was Joe mixing business with pleasure. During Joe's time on the Cape, which added up to more than half his life, he gave innumerable speeches and dramatic performances. He was in constant demand and loved to perform. In later years, he was a huge proponent of trying to keep Cape Cod from being further commercialized. Modern readers should read his 1938 novel, A. Hall and Company, for lessons regarding runaway development on Cape Cod. When we think of Joe's life, we tend to break it up into two parts. The Cape Cod part, either in Brewster or Chatham, and the off-Cape part, either in Hackensack, New Jersey, or Villanova, Pennsylvania. But there was a third part, Florida. From 1930 until his death in 1944, Joe spent a couple of months each winter in Winter Park, Florida. And it wasn't all beach chairs and golfing. Joe became very involved at Rollins College. The college produced an annual magazine, the Rollins Animated Magazine, in which notable authors were requested to contribute. In the 1934 edition of Animated Magazine, Joe's poem, The Woodbox, appeared with works by the Governor of Florida and the Attorney General of the United States. In 1935, he was on the program with the United States Secretary of State and the French ambassador to the United States. And in 1935, the 1885 graduate of Williams Grammar School was awarded a doctorate in literature by Rollins College. In Joe's last novel, The Bradshaws of Harness, published in 1943, just months before his death, he wraps up his Cape Cod adventure by predicting the future. He tells the story of Marcellus Mark Bradshaw, the heir of a generations-old Cape Cod general store founded in 1817. Mark doesn't want to run a store. He wants to fly. He walks out on the business in peacetime to become a pilot. Naturally, he is soundly bashed by the experts at the post office and the railroad depot. Mark's reputation is restored only when he comes home a war hero. While Mark is off fighting the Japanese Empire, his uncle becomes very ill, and Mark's wife, Emily, through her business savvy, saves the business. Again, Joe shows his high regard for women. Emily muses that when Mark comes home, he will probably find opportunities elsewhere off Cape, just like Joe. Joe saw the coming changes on Cape Cod and in the nation, and filled his last book with these observations. Joe died in Winter Park, Florida on March 10, 1944. His ashes were buried in Chatham's Union Cemetery. In sum, as Joe wrote about his beloved Cape Cod in Cape Cod Ballads, and when down dreamland's pathways a boy, I stroll once more, I hear the mighty music of the surf along the shore. And that is your Joe Lincoln. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Bob. And thank you everyone for sticking with us through these tech issues. Unfortunately, my video is also having some tech issues. But please take this time if you have any questions, or if you asked a question early on in the Q&A function, please just pop it back again into that box. I think I lost some of the early questions, but one of the ones that we can start with, that's a very good question from Chris Holzner. He's asking, Bob, if you can recommend some good books for newbies to Joe Lincoln. If you can suggest some of the ones that would be good to start with, that would be great.
Okay, the question is, what books would I recommend? I get that question all the time. I think Partners of the Tide is a very good one because Joe is perhaps writing about his own father. The Aristocratic Miss Brewster is also a favorite of mine. Keziah Coffin is another favorite of mine. If you start with those three, I think you'll like it. I pretty much read the books in chronological order. Some of the books tie together remotely through characters. You realize you recognize a character from another book. Generally, the stories aren't connected, but the characters might be the same. Next question.
Great, thank you, Bob. We've got another question that's dealing with the specific story of Lincoln's, and it's asking if you are familiar with a short story called The Doctor, as the person asking is a relative of the person portrayed in this story. So she's just wondering if you have any information about that short story in particular.
The question is about the short story, The Doctor. Unfortunately, I have never read that story, but I'll be looking for it now. And when I do, I'll get back to that questioner.
Great. I'll hang on for another couple of minutes. I know we're a little bit after six o'clock. So again, thank you guys so much for staying on with us. Somebody has put in the message box that apparently there's a lot of titles that you can download of Dr. Lincoln's work from Kindle. So highly recommend if people are interested in reading to look into doing that. Lots of thanks for you doing this, Bob, and again, obviously we're very thankful for you to do it as well. But we'll hang on for another couple minutes if anybody's got any questions.
Thank you, Ellie.
Yeah. And I'll ask another one actually while we're here. I'm just wondering if there's one in particular that you find interesting to reread. I know that some books kind of become more interesting as you visit them again and again, and you notice more and more interesting things. And I'm just wondering if there's any story in particular that you find.
Well, I reread several books for this talk. I just pulled them out of my bookcase indiscriminately, but right this morning I was reading Keziah Coffin again, which is a very enjoyable story. And that's the book where there's a little war going on between the two churches in town. There's a regular church, and then there's a more conservative church because people thought the regular church was too high and mighty. And the new minister of the regular church falls in love with the adopted daughter, actually adopted niece of the minister of the more conservative church. So that's a fun book.
Great, and I've got one more question about someone's asking for the name of the book that you mentioned about the Chatham Air Base that was developed right down the street from, or nearby cross trees.
Well, let me. You would think I would know that right off the top of my head, wouldn't you?
In your defense, he did write quite a few books, so I think it's very understandable for them to not all be.
I'll find that for you in a second here.
And I'll quickly answer one of the questions actually in the Q&A. Someone's asking about whether or not we recorded this, and we did record it. We're still figuring out how best to show some of these lectures at a future time. So we have recorded it, but we'll see how that kind of comes out into possible later viewings. But again, we're thankful that you all made it out today. And hopefully we'll be able to share this with some more people later on as well.
And I cannot find the name of that book. I'll find it, of course, as soon as we go off the air. And we'll get that out to that questioner. Any other questions?
There is
go ahead.
Sorry, we've got two more quick questions.
Okay.
One is about whether or not you know if the Atwood has the largest collection of Lincoln information, which I'm not entirely sure.
I know we have hundreds of books in the archives because people really do give us their collections. Their families give us their collections all the time. We just got 20 books in, I think Friday, right, Ellie?
Yep, we did.
Right.
Yeah, and I know we've got a large collection of Lincoln information, but I'm not sure if we hold the title for the biggest collection or not.
We do, and until someone says we don't, we do.
Very true. We've got one more sort of pop culture one. I know you started off the lecture sort of talking about one of the movies, or a couple of the movies that have been made about sort of following Lincoln's books. And so someone's just asking if you've liked those movies, you know, if you recommend any of them for watching.
The first one, Captain Eride, I liked the story. The production of the movie itself was pretty amateurish, but it was enjoyable. You know, it was filmed right here in Chatham, so a lot of people around here saw it. I'm not sure everybody loved it. And also, 4 or 5 of the movies are silent movies, so you might be able to get them on Netflix or someplace else, but I'm not sure.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much again, Bob. And oh, that is a great point actually coming in from the chat. One of the members of our board would like us to mention to anyone interested that our collection is still missing some of the signed versions of some of Joe Lincoln's books. So if any of you have those lying around and you would like to donate them to the museum, we would obviously welcome them. So take a look in your bookshelves in case you've got anything interesting. But on that note, I think, yeah, we'll just say thank you so much again, Bob, and thank you everyone for sticking with us through the technical difficulties, and we hope you have a great rest of your night.